Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and you know, there are wonderful rabbis all over America, rabbis whom congregants love and are doing wonderful things. Very often, a rabbi has a special gift. He does one thing or another thing better. Maybe he is able to be a pastor in a very wonderful way and is able to relate to congregants and to help them through troubling times. Sometimes they're great sermonizers. They speak from the pulpit and are wonderful. Sometimes they're involved in social action projects and are able to motivate congregants to be involved in trying to really help make this a better world. Sometimes they're involved in interfaith activities. Sometimes they're biblical scholars. And every now and then one comes across an extraordinary rabbi who blends so much of all those gifts into doing something that creates a rabbinate which other rabbis not only respect, but want to emulate. I have the enormous pleasure of sitting with an individual who I have been with in radio, television settings since 1990. This is David Wolpe. David Wolpe is the senior rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. You've authored 7 books.
Yep.
And you've been recognized by so many organizations, but one of the things that's very nice is that Newsweek magazine recognized you as the most influential rabbi on the American scene. And David, no one disagreed, which is very, very nice for you.
It's not publicly.
No one disagreed. I'd hear it if they disagreed. No one disagreed. And I just want to say to you, it's been a privilege I've had that you have gone out of your way to sit with me from time to time. The first time we sat was in 1990. I don't know if you remember that. You had done Healer of Shattered Hearts.
Right.
And you came back. We were both of us much younger then. And you have done extraordinary things since then. And it's an honor to sit with you again. And
Thank you.
We've spoken many times on the phone. I want to tell you how really wonderful it is. I've been looking forward to sitting with you,
Thank you.
as much as any
It's
guest.
so nice to be here.
Thank you. And as you can imagine, there's so many things I want to talk to you about because you have a unique vantage point, not only a unique perspective of your own, but you are at a major synagogue, conservative synagogue in Los Angeles.
Right.
And from there, not only do you see the conservative movement, you see really the landscape of whatever California Jewry means.
Right.
And in some way, you've seen the landscape of American Jewry, and you travel a great deal, you speak a great deal. And in addition, you've had the ability to put into writing the feelings you've had about life, your own personal experiences, and you are one of the most courageous individuals writing on the American Jewish scene. You are courageous enough to write about God. Very few people write about God, and you've done it in a very sensitive way. And so as I'm saying to myself, what do I want to talk to David about? You know, we'll sit on L'Chaim for an hour. What do I want? So I want to begin first with you, and then we'll go to the Jewish scene as a whole. Okay. And anybody who knows you had a battle with cancer yourself, and that not only were you able to transcend, but it also seemed to affect how you viewed the world, your relationship to God, the Jewish people. You learn that you have some form of cancer. Was it brain, correct? It was lymphoma of some kind?
Both. I had a brain tumor and then I had lymphoma.
Okay. You find this out.
Yes.
So what goes through your mind and your soul when you learn you have serious cancer?
Well, they were different, the 2 episodes, because the first time it started off with a seizure. And whatever was going through my brain, I was thoroughly unaware of it. And even when later I was told that there was something there, I was still not, I think, aware enough to really feel the keenness of the fear that I felt later. But what goes through your mind, first of all, is what I think goes through any father's mind, which is, will my child grow up without a father? Yes. That was more than anything else. What didn't go through my mind through any of my health crises is why me?
Right.
That I didn't think. And the
Why do you
reason-
think that is?
Well, in part because I was never a victim of bad theology. A lot of people, unfortunately, learned that if you're a good person, only good things will happen. And despite the abundant evidence to the contrary in life, they still believe that. I knew that there's a great deal of randomness in the world. And also I knew that, as I have said before, a lot of congregants will come into my office and they'll say, this terrible thing happened, why me? That terrible thing happened, why me? Very rarely will they come in and say, I was born in the richest country in the history of the world, why me? Or, I have healthy children, why me? But the truth is, almost all of us have been abundantly blessed.
Absolutely.
So I don't understand why it is that I assume that I have to be blessed forever and ever and ever, and nothing bad will ever happen to me. So, although don't get me wrong, I wasn't happy about it. I didn't think that God owed me everlasting health. The world doesn't work that way.
Okay, take one half step back. Your father.
Yes.
Am I correct? Your father was a rabbi?
Yes.
Okay. What was, as you were growing up, what was the perspective of, and I don't want to say God, I want to say, what did you feel the perspective was on life from your father, who came out of this from the Jewish tradition?
So here's what my favorite story about my father is my father was a disciple. My father was named Gerald Wolpe, and he was the rabbi of our Sinai Temple in Philadelphia for 30 years. Wonderful man, remarkable rabbi, magnificent speaker. His rabbinate, though, was not about God. His rabbinate was about Soviet Jewry, building federations, schools, recovering from the trauma of the Holocaust and reconstituting the Jewish community. And very rarely, God was invoked at brisses and bar mitzvahs, but very rarely did he talk about God. And years later, when I had already graduated and I was writing, when my second book came out, which was called In Speech and in Silence, The Jewish Quest for God, I got a call from Newsweek magazine, so a long time ago, in the early 90s. And they said, we're doing a cover story on God. Would you be willing to be interviewed? So I said, sure, I'd be happy to be interviewed. And to make a long story short, when the magazine finally came out, I said all the sorts of things I just said to you. I pulled it from the newsstand, I opened it up, and inside there's a picture of me, and underneath it begins as follows. My father is a rabbi and a good one, but growing up in his house, he never once mentioned God. So I saw that and I thought, oh no, this is terrible. Because I could hear the voices of his congregants in my head, and I knew which ones. And they would say, look, they seem to get along so well, but look what he says about his father in a national magazine. So I rushed into work and sprang into action. I called home. My mother was there.
Had she read it?
No. I said, this is what I said. This is what they wrote, I had called my father, and he said, don't worry about it. It's okay. My father was a very gentle, kind man. He said, don't worry about it. These things happen, so on and so forth. Then I called my mother, and I said, look, I just spoke to him. Really, he's all right. And she said, the only thing she said in the whole conversation, she said, uh-huh. So I thought, maybe I haven't heard the end of this. And then, in fact, a week later, there was a letter from my father in my mailbox. And I opened it up, and inside it says, Dear David, God, 100 times down the page. And then the PS was, P.S., this is just in case Time calls you for an interview. So
he has a good sense
he had a wonderful sense of humor.
Did you laugh?
But, oh, sure, I cracked up. But the truth was that was his rabbinate. His rabbinate was about the sociological reality, the historical reality, the continuity and identity of the Jewish people and the state of Israel.
Yes, and you understand,
It wasn't
I understand
theological.
your father 100%. It was not an anti-God rabbinate.
No.
It just was expressed in a very different way.
Yes.
And you didn't mean to say in that piece anything of a negative nature.
Rather, it was the focus of his rabbinate
and
the Jewish people.
You were talking to a mainstream at the time, now everything's online, but at the time it was to a mainstream national magazine. It didn't have a Jewish bias.
No.
When it was talking about God,
Right.
it wasn't talking about God the way the Jewish people talk about
That's right.
God. And therefore, they heard you in a very different way than what you may have meant.
Yes.
And I understand.
think that's true.
I understand who your father was.
Right. But the issue, right, the issue was exactly as you say, which is that his generation was a generation that had other priorities.
That is correct. By the way, I don't know that you and I would agree on this. A lot of religion in general, and Judaism in particular, and you learn this from Maimonides where he talks about the mashal and the parable. Much of the Jewish tradition is poetry, and it's poetry that's trying to capture an essence of a human experience and also what is meant by God. One of the reasons why I've had enormous respect for what you've done is that I've heard you speak on many occasions, is that you are trying to explain to an audience, very often a predominantly Jewish audience, but not necessarily all Jewish, the Jewish idiom, the Jewish imagination of God, the Jewish mystery that is in God. And so for you, it seems to me, you have put much more effort in trying to help us understand what we might mean by the word God.
I think that and the way you started out is exactly what I do believe, which is that you can only talk about God, even though Buber said you can't talk about God, you can only talk to God, but still, to the extent that you talk about God, it has to be through metaphor and through poetry, because God is ununderstandable and inexpressible. And what I say to my high school students is, could you imagine when you were 2 years old what it is to be 15? It's not just that you couldn't imagine it, you don't even know what it is that you don't know. Well, God in relation to us, whatever God is infinitely greater than we are to 2-year-olds. So for us to assume that we have a grasp on this
That's wonderful.
is ridiculous.
That is wonderful. When you realize you do have a serious cancer,
Yes.
I understand you don't say, why me?
Yeah.
And did you in any way think God did this to you?
No. Nor did I think that God would necessarily take it away from me.
Correct.
In fact, I remember sitting in the chemotherapy, the treatment room. And I thought to myself, okay, traditional prayer sort of assumes that it works this way. Wolpe over there in bed 5 has been praying, and he's got other people around him who are praying. He's good. The guy in bed 3, I've heard nothing from, so I'm done with him. And I thought, it can't work that way, obviously. Whatever the alchemy is of what prayers do, it's not so cut and dried that you pray and you get, or you don't pray and you don't get. While I wouldn't say, I mean, it's too deistic, it's too pulling God out of the world to say God has nothing to do with this. I don't believe that you can rely on prayer to solve the deeper problems of life. And the main purpose of prayer is to change us. It's like the medieval Rabbi Leona Medina, a little later in the medieval age. He said, imagine you were standing on a shore and you saw a man pulling a boat to the shore. If you didn't understand mechanics and motion, you might think he was pulling the shore to the boat. And the same thing when we pray. We think we're pulling God to us, but really if you pray well, what you're doing is you're pulling yourself to God. So I tried to pray to come to terms with what was happening and to have courage, not for God to reach down and change my blood.
That's very lovely again. So. For you, there is a personal God.
For me, God is extremely abstract and very personal.
Both.
Yes.
Explain.
I don't believe in a God, as I said, I don't believe in a God who reaches down and but I believe that there is, whatever God is, it is possible somehow with some faculty that human beings have to make some connection with that deeper sense of purpose and meaning and transcendence that God is. And that touches the deepest personal part of who we are. So even though God is impersonal in some sense, is abstract in some sense, God is also deeply personal. I really have been very influenced by Buber's idea that you can only address God as an I, thou, not just asking for stuff, but with the fullness of your being. But also, I think with the Jewish tradition's general sense that the world is not a place bereft of God's love.
Mm-hmm. And what do you do personally when there are members of your congregation who express either doubt or even reject the notion of the existence of a real God? And I'm using the word God here as the Jewish tradition.
Right.
I am not imagining an invisible man with a beard and a stick.
Right.
No. But I want to take the way you've just expressed it beautifully, the notion of God. I believe what you expressed is the essence of what the rabbis are trying to communicate, although they use anthropomorphic poetry.
Right.
But now you're dealing with somebody who says to you, Rabbi, or David, I don't know what they call you.
Both.
I'm not sure. Or for me, it just doesn't work. I just don't believe that. I'm happy for you, but it's not how I view the world. What do you, as both a rabbi and as a Jewish guy?
It depends what I mean, look, I'll engage them, I'll talk to them, I'll find out what it is they do care about.
Are you offended by them?
No. Makes perfect
Does it make
sense.
them less of a Jew to you?
Not less of a Jew, certainly not. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Whether somebody is a good Jew or a bad Jew, it seems to me, depends more, if there is such a category, and I don't get to decide anyway, depends more on what you do than what you believe.
Absolutely.
Although those things are not entirely unrelated, because what you believe will affect what you do. But having said that, no, it doesn't offend me and it doesn't surprise me, and it's very common. So I will engage them in whatever dialogue they're willing to engage in. And sometimes you move someone and sometimes not. But that's,
very fair.
Okay.
I want to push you a little bit.
Sure.
I want to argue that the state of ambivalence is a state the rabbis understood very, very well, and that although there is an ideal, that the Jewish tradition is very, very tolerant and patient with the individual who is, and I will now use a word you understand, perplexed.
Yeah.
And that I don't need anybody to be sure. I want people to be searching. I want them to be open. And in some way, David, I am frightened by the person who says to me, I know for sure there is no God. How do you know for sure? And in some way, when somebody says to me, I'm absolutely sure there is a God, I don't understand them either.
I think that there's a certain personality disposition that is comfortable with ambiguity and ambivalence, and a personality disposition that's not. And for each of them, talk to each other in their own terms, but they have a very hard time adopting the other person's point of view. So you will find many, many expressions in the Jewish tradition of the importance of certainty, and you'll find many expressions of the permissibility and even the merit of doubt.
Yes.
But one of the things that I've discovered is when people say Judaism is or Judaism says, it's always a selective reading of the texts, because Judaism is too old and too varied to not have said almost everything about everything. So in that sense, I would say yes, you could certainly make a reading of Judaism that allows for the ambiguity, and I like that reading myself. But you could also make a very fine reading for Judaism says you must believe this and you must do that if you wanted to.
Yes, or if you wanted to.
Right.
Although it's interesting, you already said that the Jewish tradition emphasizes how you behave.
Yes, it does.
And when you walk through a synagogue door, no one says to you or asks you what you believe. No. They do expect you to say Amen at the end of a blessing.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to transition to something else you got a lot of press about, which in some way, again, courageous, but it also surprised me. Not about you, but the reaction surprised me. And David, you have to help me with the details. Was it on Passover or on the High Holiday? It was a Passover, right? You said to your congregation in a public speech from the pulpit,
right?
You questioned the historicity of the biblical story.
The biblical story in general, but the Exodus in particular.
Okay. And it made front page news in the Jewish world.
I know.
So first of all, I want to know, I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to talk then.
Right.
I said to myself, but David is right. And I was surprised. Doesn't everybody know David is right?
Well, one of the things that was surprising
But
about
first,
it,
for our audience,
I'll tell you what
summarize
happened.
what you said.
It was about 10 years ago, and it was on Passover. And because Passover coincides with Nowruz, I have a large number of Persians in my congregation, many of whom come out first day of Passover to synagogue, despite having been up late, as we all are with the Seder the night before. And so there were about 2,000 people there. And I said, the Exodus didn't happen the way all archaeologists agree.
Right.
I said virtually all archaeologists agree that the Exodus didn't happen the way it's recorded in the Bible, if it happened at all. Well, and then I went on to say that for me, that actually didn't matter, and don't think that it should matter for them. And the motivations, before I talk about the reaction, the motivation was, first of all, to inoculate those people. And now it's funny, I still get letters from students who say, now I heard this in college, but now I know that it's okay, that I can still believe despite the fact. And also the purpose was...
What do they mean, it's okay to believe?
In other words, they can still hold on to their Jewish identity and their Jewish tradition despite the fact that the Bible is not literal.
Yes.
And the second was that this was a commonplace in conservative and reform rabbinical schools for 50 years. Everybody learned biblical criticism. Everybody learned these were human documents that were compiled over time, and nobody ever talked to the congregation about it. And if they did, they talked to them in small classes. Because many people did say to me, why didn't you do this in a class? I said, basically, you mean I should have said it so that nobody heard. And I understand that motivation, but that wasn't my intent. My intent was for people to hear it, although I had no idea that it would be the shot heard around the world. I got many, many angry letters and many supportive and beautiful letters. The burden of the one was you took away, I was the Grinch that stole Pesach. And the other was, this is what I've always suspected or what I've always learned and so on, and it's wonderful to
I
hear.
don't care about those people.
Fine.
I want to hear about the ones who were upset with you. And what were you hoping the people would begin to understand?
The people who were upset, there were some who were upset because they felt one well-known personality in the Jewish world took me out to lunch and said, we all know this is true, nobody's supposed to say it. That was his feeling. His feeling was, this is one of those things, like, I don't know, whatever, like Washington and the cherry tree, that you don't tell people this is not true because it's damaging to their faith system.
He took you out to lunch to tell you this?
Yes.
Somebody you respected?
Yes. Smart guy, not a rabbi, but very much in the Jewish world.
And how did what went through your mind?
Okay, I'm not surprised to hear people say, I'm surprised to hear you say it. I'm not surprised to hear people say it in general, but I don't think ultimately that we can survive that way. So, look, I began the sermon by talking about the fact that Emerson says that God gives every mind a choice between truth and repose. And you have to pick one because you can't have both. You can either rest or you can actually search for what's true. And it seems to me that religion in part ought to be a search for what actually is true. And if you make a historical claim, and 600,000 people left Egypt is a historical claim, men left Egypt is a historical claim, then you have to be willing to say, what does history have to say about it? Believing in God is not a historical claim. History doesn't have anything to say about that. But they walked across the desert is. So in the end, what I said to my daughter when she asked me at a certain point, how I felt about the whole thing, was I remembered what Churchill said after the Boer War. He said, it's exhilarating to be shot at without result. And the truth was, I was still there, I still had a job, and although people still ask me about it, I think my very biased read is, in the end, it turned out to be a good thing, not a bad thing.
Absolutely. I was very proud of you.
Thank you. But other people don't think so.
Okay. Now let's push you a little bit.
Yeah.
Because there's a logical question that comes out of that. Okay, the Exodus is not a historical document, event, at least the way it's described. Right. And I've already said in this discussion, and I teach this all the time on Shalom TV, the Torah is this exquisite poem written in a narrative style.
Right.
And there's truth in it.
Right.
It's not about literal truth. It's about a bigger truth.
Yes.
It's not about history. It's not meant to be a history book or a science book. But there's truth in it of a different nature.
Yes.
the person who hears us say this will ask, well, David, is there anything really true about the 5 books of Moses? Was there a moment at Sinai? If there's no Exodus, is there no Sinai? Right. And if there's no Sinai for you historically, what is the Torah? But this is not me asking.
No,
but
I
these are
understand.
the kind of questions you hear all the time.
Of course.
I want to give you a chance to address it on Shalom TV.
So,
what is Sinai, that moment for you, if it is not history? And what is Torah, the mitzvot, the midrash, the Talmud? What is all that to
Sinai
David Wolpe?
is a metaphor, a literal record, doesn't matter to me, actually, of God's revelation of God's self to the Jewish people. That is, Jews had a powerful collective experience of the reality of God. And from that was born probably the greatest intellectual, spiritual revolution in the history of humanity. And out of that developed a language. And by that I mean ritual is a language. When people, what does a flag say? You can't put into words what a flag represents because symbols say things that are over and above language. So when you light Shabbat candles, you can't say what it means. If you could, you would just say it. It represents something powerful. And it's the language that we speak to God, our ritual. But that ritual language, I believe, was developed by the Jewish people to speak to God. It wasn't thrown down from above. It was rather gathered up and offered from below. So because God exists and the world is, there are fundamental moral principles that exist. Not always easy to know them and not always easy to apply them, but they're real. And that was part of the sort of rock solid intuition of realizing that there's one God. You see the difference between the way the Greek gods act and the way the Jews think the world should be because of one God. So monotheism, that insight of monotheism, gave birth to both the reality of morals and to a system of ritual and language that is Judaism. The problem, in quotes, with that view for many is, well, what about these other religions? And my unsatisfactory to some people, but my answer to that is that my job is to argue Judaism's excellence, not its superiority. I actually don't think that it's my job to say we're better than they are. It is to say here is the oldest continuous system known to human beings for growing a soul, and it's beautiful and it's transcendent and it's deep and it works well and it's some kind of inexplicable combination of strands of human and divine. And if you explore it, you'll discover that it's remarkable.
You wrote a book about how you talk about God to children.
Right.
Why did you write that book?
I wrote it because I didn't have any children. And because I knew that once I had a child, all my advice would go right down the tubes. It seemed to me ridiculous to write it once you had a kid. So I wrote it also because I found that the questions that adults were asking me again and again and again were because they, in part, they got the kind of Hebrew school instruction that set them up for bad questions. Not bad questions, but questions that they should know better than if they had been properly. So I wanted to start parents giving kids good answers early on rather than doing it later.
So give us one example.
So here's a story that I heard from someone that I put in the book is about a guy who looks up at the world and says, God, there's so much pain and suffering and anguish in your world. Why don't you send help? And God says, I did send help. I sent you. That idea, the idea that God doesn't just supernaturally change everything, but actually God uses human beings to change the world, that's good, solid theology. I mean, why does God have to pick prophets in the Bible? Why does God have to have Moses go to Pharaoh? Why doesn't God just say, you know, okay, all the Jews go? Even in the most miraculous times, God still uses human beings. And so to see, you know, that the doctor is part of God's hands in this world, that's a beautiful idea. Another example of this is the question of, obviously, bad things and good people. And one of the many parts of the answer that I talk about is to talk to kids about dolls, the difference between dolls and human beings. Because a doll does whatever you tell it to, and a doll moves however you want it to move. But people have free will, and that means that they do bad things too. And yes, God could stop you every time you did something bad, but just imagine that would make you into a puppet, into a doll. And you don't want to be that. So using those kinds of analogies when you're young, I think, helps theological thinking as you get older. What happens is that parents are so badly equipped that they'll say things that they really, I'll give you a common example. Why did Uncle so-and-so die? Because God wanted them close. Which will happen all the time. Or he was so good that God called his soul back, which tells the kid what? First of all, don't be so good, because then God's going to call your soul back. Or if you really are dear to God, you will die. Because when you die, you're close to God, which also tells the child in life you're not close to God. So there are all sorts of bad theological ideas.
Everything about that statement is terrible.
Bad, but it's very, very common, and it's common because people haven't learned better or thought about it much. So that was the point of the book. It really was for adults, but it was for kids.
Isn't it
really for adults.
It's really for parents.
It's really for
no
parents.
matter how you phrase the title or
It's
whoever
really
picked
for
the
parents,
title,
yes.
I agree with you.
It's really for parents.
And look, we may not agree on this. My own sense is it's hard enough to be an adult and really work out what do you mean by God? What's it mean to have a relationship with God? How does God fit into this complex, often painful world? I don't think a child has a clue about what the real issues are.
No.
And the trick is, and in some way you've just said this, the best way is to not make mistakes when you talk to your children about God.
Yes.
Yeah.
But who doesn't? Who is so good that they never make mistakes?
Yes. Once you had a child,
Yes.
did you do pretty well with it? Because you have thought about it more than
I
the
thought about
average
it a lot.
parent.
I did well in one way and not in another. I would say that I did well. She's a wonderful kid in every way. I did well in terms of not saying things to her that I later had to deny. I didn't say things to her and then later have to say, oh, that wasn't really true. But I think that it was hard for her to see me as the rabbi of the synagogue and nonetheless to make Judaism her own. It was so much mine and my profession that I think it's going to be a long time. She's 16 now as of this interview. It's going to be a long time before she decides what part of her learning and training, because she's gone to a day school her whole life, is her own and what part belongs to her father.
That is so honest, David.
That's true.
It's that you've seen it many times. Sometimes it's very hard to be the child.
It's very hard.
Was it hard for you, your father being a rabbi?
It was hard, but not nearly as hard as I think it is for my daughter because, well, in one way it was harder because I was a boy. And so, but on the other hand, I had 3 brothers, so it got diffused. We were all, whereas my daughter is an only. And also it was a different age. And by that I mean everybody bought into the rabbi's kids are supposed to be a certain way. So we bought into it too when I was a child. So we bought into it too. Later on you have rebellion against it, but that was the system. Now the system is everybody's an individual. So my daughter, I think, was caught between people telling her you have to be your own person and so on and so forth, but this great unspoken cultural expectation among most of the congregants that she would be perfect because she's the rabbi's daughter, you know?
Yes.
So I don't know. Yeah, I think every rabbi's kid feels it.
You have no idea yet.
No idea.
I mean,
no idea.
You already said she's spectacular.
Right. Yeah.
And she'll find her own way.
She will. I'm not actually worried about it.
But you have seen the children of rabbis sometimes have a very hard time.
A very hard time.
So transition for me now. There are many wonderful things happening in Jewish life. I know that. Right. You have an unusual synagogue. It's not fair to use Sinai Temple as the model for everything going on in Jewish life. There is an enormous number, a majority of American Jews are unaffiliated.
Right.
Almost 65% have never been to the state of Israel. And younger people, it seems to me, while there are pockets of exciting, enthusiastic things done in a creative way by young people, there's this mass of young people who it's not even a rejection of Judaism. It's like it doesn't matter. So I want to know, as you look at the Jewish people today, what concerns you the most?
I mean, what you said, in terms of the survival of non-literalist Judaism, what concerns me is, intermarriage, assimilation, lack of education, indifference, here and in Israel. Both.
Non-literalist.
Yes.
Oh, I love you. By the way, is in some way, the people who are listening,
yes,
you chose a very specific phrase,
yes.
Non-literalist.
Yep.
You didn't say the non-Orthodox community.
Right.
Because?
Because I actually think that the Orthodox community that struggles with the modern world, they also have a tremendous challenge. And only those that have a very literalist reading of the tradition and essentially shut out the modern world, they're very comfortable, and they have many, many children, and I don't think that they're in danger of disappearing. They are, however, unable to affect the world. So if the Jewish mission is to actually make a difference in the world, they're failing in that mission. But in terms of sustaining themselves almost Pennsylvania Dutch-like, that they will succeed in doing.
Are you worried at times that, and I'm going to use that phrase, non-Orthodox Judaism, the Jewish pluralism that you and I have grown up with, that has dominated and represented America since the beginning of the 20th century,
yes,
is it in danger of ending?
Not anytime soon, but in time, yes. But with at least two big caveats. One is, remember that most of conservative Judaism got its energy from defections early on from Orthodoxy.
It's true.
And there's a worldwide wave of fundamentalism right now in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam.
Oh, footnote,
So,
why?
Well, that's a good question, but there is.
There is.
The point, and the day that wanes, where are all those literalist Jews going to go? As far as I'm concerned, the 22nd century is going to be a bonanza for conservative Judaism. So it may not be today, but eventually.
It just has to hang on.
It has to hang on because it's getting less and less plausible to be intellectually aware and to deny the realities of the modern world. It's just harder. I mean, it's harder to say Darwin was wrong than it was 50 years ago, and it's going to be harder in 50 years, and you will literally have to say, don't say that name to me in order to shut. The second is that, I take comfort, he's been often quoted, but it's a wonderful essay in Simon Ravidovich's essay about Israel, the ever-dying people. In every generation, Jews say, we're
It's
really,
over, right?
It's over, we're done, we're in trouble. And yet, somehow, we do seem to be ever renewing. So
There's a difference, though.
I am by nature an optimist, even though I certainly acknowledge, yes, the tremendous danger of the disappearance of non-literalist Judaism.
Yes. The difference, by the way, is we're disappearing now because they're nice to us.
Right. Yes,
And
as we did in Spain, and we were starting to do in Germany. But yes, I agree. So, but when you say the difference, another way of saying that is this is historically unprecedented. So what is historically unprecedented has results that we've not yet seen. We'll see.
You talk about conservative Judaism. It's true for Reform Judaism also.
Both.
Okay. And it's interesting again. For me, I love Orthodoxy as well, and I'm very happy for Jews who are much more observant than I am or have a different philosophy. And the only thing I resent is if anybody's ever told in the Jewish spectrum, they're Jewish and you're not. But I would miss very much the Jewish community. I would feel the Jewish community missed something enormously important if non-Orthodoxy were not an option, and if this pluralistic model that really spawned us was somehow lost.
You'd be missing, among other things, most of the Jewish world.
That's right.
I know.
And as you see Israel today, and I don't know the extent to which you deal with this from the pulpit all the time or sometime, there's a lot of concern within the non-Orthodox world, within the movements of conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism. Why isn't Israel somehow more pluralistic? Where do you come out on that?
I just actually wrote for Tablet an article about the women of the wall, which is kind of, at the moment, is the lightning rod for this question. I'm concerned about it too, and I think it's partly a structural problem, partly because Israel does not have separation of synagogue and state, which is a terrible mistake for Israel, for Jews, and for Judaism. And it's also a problem of polarity. That is, when the only model that you present is a very traditional model, the alternative that you allow is be nothing or be this. So a lot of Israelis have by default been nothing, and then the influx from the Soviet Union, where people for generations have been raised officially atheistically, reinforces that. Do I have hope, which is not exactly what you asked, but I'll ask myself, for the reforming conservative movements in Israel? I have hope that they will make some inroads, as they have done. Whether they will be as successful as I would wish, I don't know. I don't know. And I think that the jury is still out on that.
Does it offend you?
Here's what offends me. To the extent that I am offended as opposed to concerned or worried, I'm offended by the assumption that one side is principled and the other side is not. That is, egalitarianism isn't a principle, it's just nonsense. That idea, the idea that all principle resides with literalist Judaism, that offends me and is a product of a real inability to understand the other.
Well said.
So
yes,
that's what offends me.
Okay. Now come back to 2,000 people sitting in front of you. To what extent is mixed marriage, intermarriage, a reality in your conservative synagogue?
It's a reality, but it is not as big a reality as it is in many other conservative synagogues, in part because, as I said, about half my synagogue is Iranian Jews. And while intermarriage is beginning in the Iranian Jewish community, it's much lower than it is in the Ashkenazi community. And there, again, there is a tremendous battle. And this battle doesn't only exist in intermarriage, it exists in almost everywhere in life. That is, if you set a standard, are you encouraging people who are beneath that standard to rise above it? Or are you just discouraging everyone because they say, well, you have a standard that doesn't include us? And that's the great question for synagogues. If you are inclusive and you say non-Jews may do everything Jews may do, are you saying to Jews, doesn't matter that you're Jewish? Or are you saying to non-Jews, we want you and we want to include you? And if you say both, is that ultimately a net gain or a net loss? And we don't have it figured out any better than anyone else, but it's a struggle.
Okay, but where do you come out? What would you like to be?
I would like to be as inclusive as possible while maintaining distinctions.
Okay, just a minute. So there's a Jewish man with a non-Jewish wife.
Right.
And there's some kind of minhag in your synagogue where Friday night candles are lit?
We don't have a blessing said by the Jewish partner.
You would not?
Only by the non-Jewish partner, sorry. No, the Jewish partner says the blessing.
Would you ever
and the reason that the non-Jewish partner doesn't say the blessing is because it's a lie. Asher tzivanu b'mitzvotav, who has commanded us with your commandments. Well, that's true if you're Jewish, but we don't believe that if you're not Jewish. So if you want to turn the blessing into a mantra or into a pleasant phrase, then you can say it. But if you want it to actually be a blessing, then you have to say the blessing is said. Same reason why, in theory, you don't do mixed marriages. Whatever the effect of them on the Jewish community, you can't say Kedat Moshe Yisrael according to the laws of Moses and Israel because it's not true. So,
now, as a conservative rabbi, I assume you are not normally put in a position where some family of your congregation calls you and says, would you officiate, would you be the Masader Kedushin at a mixed marriage?
I've been asked.
Do you ever do it?
No.
Do you ever have doubts or question your own whether you should?
Not whether I should. I have regrets and sadness.
Sadness, I understand. Why regret?
That the world is the way it is, so the people that I'm close to,
you can't be there for them.
I can't be there for them, which is hard. It's hard, and it gets harder, not easier.
And what do you say to those who argue? Listen, David, the world is what it is.
Right.
You're going to be pushing people away. It would be better for you to you are able to motivate, inspire people, and bring them close to the tradition. Bring this non-Jewish couple, mixed marriage couple, bring the non-Jew into Jewish
Well, I say to
life.
them two things. One is what I said before, which is it's a farce for me to officiate according to Jewish law. And the second is I ask them, does that mean that there should be in every area no distinction whatsoever between a Jew and a non-Jew? And if so, what should the distinction be? That's what I want to know. Because my sense is that if there's going to be a distinction, then the distinction ought to at least start with the blessing under the chuppah of a rabbi at a wedding. But it's hard.
Yes,
It's hard
it
and
is.
it's painful.
And again, sometimes it's most painful because you know these people
Right.
well and you love
Exactly.
them.
Yes.
Would you have any objection referring them to a rabbi who would be the Maseder Kedushin?
No.
And if they then were married, would you welcome them into the congregation with the
Absolutely.
proviso that
Absolutely.
the non-Jew could not do certain things?
Right. Yes. And we do.
And they're treated, both of them are treated
Yes.
as absolute members of the congregation.
Yes.
Would you let the non-Jew serve on the board?
Hasn't come up in our congregation so far, so I wouldn't like to pronounce on it before I would want the board and others to talk about it. My inclination would be to say, unless you are committed to the mission of the congregation, which is in fact to grow and perpetuate Jewish life, then you shouldn't be on the board. And if you are committed to grow and perpetuate Jewish life, you're a perfect place to start.
Right.
If you're not, then if you don't do that for yourself, then on the other hand, there is a certain gratitude that I think we have to feel for a non-Jew who's raising their kids Jewish. Of
course.
So it's, these are not easy questions, and people who take hard and fast positions, I think, haven't grappled with the complexity of it.
Are you critical of Reform colleagues in Los Angeles and across the country who take, obviously, a different tact? And not all Reform rabbis do, but there are some in the Reform movement who are the ones standing
right.
there saying, no, David, you're making a mistake.
Rather than say I'm critical of them, I would say I disagree with them.
Yes.
Yeah. I disagreed with patrilineal descent. I thought that it was a mistake. The idea that if you're raised Jewish, it doesn't matter if your mother or your father's Jewish. And the reason I thought it was a mistake was because it makes Judaism behaviorally determined. It's not anymore. It used to be a family.
Right.
You're born into this family or you join this family. Now you're not part of the family unless you behave a certain way. And that didn't used to be the case. So if you're born of does that mean if you're born of a Jewish mother and father but you're not raised Jewish that you're not Jewish? That doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, so, but when you say am I critical, I disagree.
Okay, a gay couple comes to you.
Yes.
And they're both Jewish.
Yes.
2 men, 2 women.
Yes.
And they want you to be the Maseder Kedushin. What does David Wolpe do?
Well, it's very interesting. I wish you were asking me actually 6 months from now, because we're in the midst of grappling with this very question in the synagogue. I'm giving 2 classes. I gave one about homosexuality in Jewish law. I'm going on sabbatical for a few months. When I come back, I'm going to give the second class about homosexuality at Sinai Temple. So if you ask me in about 2-3 months, I'll have a definitive answer.
I want a cameraman there.
Okay.
And finally, what about the state of Israel? And it's impossible for a rabbi now not to at least be sensitive to Palestinian-Israeli conflict, 2-state solution, what do we do, J Street, AIPAC. As you look at the Jewish landscape, first of all, what's your sense of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And what do you try to stand for as a rabbi at one of the major synagogues in America?
My principle, we send the largest delegation to AIPAC of any institution in the country, and we have for about the last 6-7 years.
Do you go?
Yes, I go every year. I won't go this year because of my sabbatical, but I've gone every year. My sense is that the primary responsibility of American Jews is to support the state of Israel and, secondarily, the government of Israel. And I say that because it's not that I don't have criticisms of the government of Israel, the state of Israel, but my kids aren't on the border. And so I have to be very careful not to never express criticism, but the self-righteousness with which some people here express their criticism is, to me, off-putting and inappropriate. I suppose I could be convinced that sitting in a home in Westwood, I know better what they should do on the Golan Heights than those commanders do. But a little becoming humility is appropriate here. And so my first inclination, and that's one of the reasons why I support AIPAC, is to support the left or right government of Israel, because the citizens of Israel are the ones who have to make that decision. So, so my job is to also, I think, try to support those candidates and politicians and so on who I believe care about Israel's security.
Are you given grief for that position in your congregation?
Not so much in my congregation, some in my congregation, and in the community sometimes.
I mean,
But
people say you're too far right. That's not a liberal
some people
Jewish
have said
position.
too far right, and on some comments I've made too far left. So here's what happened.
On Israel?
This is what happened. I gave the benediction at the Democratic National
Yes.
Convention. So people said, you support Obama, you're too far left. Then I wrote an article about Iran and the nuclear bomb, and I got the same people who came back and said, we see you support Romney. And some people were upset because they had thought, they were very happy when they thought I supported Obama. That made me very happy, because I really don't think that a rabbi should use his position for political purposes. So if my congregation is confused about who I support, that's good with me.
Good for you.
Yeah.
The written word has always been primary to the Jewish people. It's amazing how we revere books, even as the entire practice of reading and publishing is dying.
Yeah.
The Jew still remains the people of the book.
Yeah.
And you have written book after book.
Yes.
I believe your most recent book is Why Faith Matters.
It is.
Okay. Why does faith matter?
So faith matters because it changes the way that you see the world, and it gives the world a purpose, and it gives the soul an orientation, and it also moves people to do good in the world. I don't think people realize how much of the everyday goodness of the world is done by people of faith. I went down to help my friend Mitch Allen, Tuesdays with Maury guy. He's building an orphanage in Haiti. So I went down there to help. Almost everybody who was there building that orphanage and helping the surrounding area were Christian aid workers. Their faith was why they were there. I saw one guy, I said, why are you here? He goes, well, my son's been here for 25 years. He was a Mennonite. He said, so about 10 years ago, I thought, I got to go too. It was only because he thought God wanted him to. And the word is, I mean, look, in the Jewish tradition, it says God spoke and the world came into being. So, yeah, we love the word. It is intangible, powerful, inexplicable, infinite, various. It's a lot like God.
And this comes out of nowhere for you, but I just would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
So how do you see what we're doing here? We're television.
Right.
There has never been a serious attempt to do Jewish television before. And people very often will say to me, you know, whoa, Shalom TV, why hasn't there been Jewish television before? Now, we're not the only Jewish television on the air right now, but we're the only PBS style Jewish channel. And we're not the written word.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I'm sitting with you. There are tens of thousands of people watching you right now on Shalom TV. Perhaps even more that will read your book. But somehow the fact that you've written a book will endure in a way that this conversation will not.
Although
and I want an honest answer.
Yeah.
What do you think of the fact that there is a Jewish television channel for the first time in America?
The spoken word is also precious to the Jewish people. Not only the written word, you know. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said, other people tell stories to put people to sleep. I tell mine to wake people up.
That's lovely.
So the spoken word has its power too, and television and other media enable the spoken word to go all around the world. I mean, remember that God, before God wrote, God spoke. God said, let there be light. The writing came later.
Very good. So. You are here today because of the Simon Wiesenthal Center.
Yes.
I don't want to end without your saying a word, because I know how important it is to you. And you're close to Marvin, you're close to all of them. But not everybody understands the breadth of work they do. And I want you to just say to our audience, why is it? What's important to you about the Simon Wiesenthal Center that you would travel across the country to speak today, and you have given so much of yourself to?
What's important to me about what they do is that they preserve the memory of anti-Semitism for a Jewish and a universal purpose. That's what's so remarkable about it. It's not just this terrible thing was done to the Jews, so care about the Jews. But if you go to the Museum of Tolerance, you can find out about the Rwandan genocide and the Cambodian genocide and the Armenian genocide. In other words, what happened to the Jews has to be a lesson for the rest of the world, and never again has to mean never again for everyone, not never again to the Jewish people. And that's exactly what the Jews ought to be doing. And so it is in that sense, it's the quintessential Jewish mission, what they do.
You are fabulous in every sense of the word, and I am so grateful to have that.
My great pleasure.
You and I have grown up together, and it's been my
sure.
pleasure to know you from time to time.
Thank you.
I wish you kol tuva
Thank you, Mark.
from strength to strength. You'll go leading
too.
us. Thank you,
Thank
David
you.
Wolpe. My conversation with David Wolpe, not only at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, but also one of the outstanding writers on the American Jewish scene, thinkers, as you've heard. And it's been a pleasure for me to talk to him. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas that David expressed. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. And if you want to be in touch with David Wolpe, you can do so by emailing me, and I will forward your emails on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.